Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'm Lisa Mandel. I'm the Development Director for Greenwich Library, and I am delighted to welcome you to AuthorsLive. This series is made possible through the support of the Greenwich Library Board of Trustees and contributions from generous donors just like you. Couple reminders for this evening. We would like you to keep your masks on at all times, please. Silence your phones and please refrain from using them or taking photos during the event. And finally, books will be available for sale and signing in the theater lobby directly after the talk tonight. Our moderator this evening is Barbara Hofert, who we're very happy to welcome. We wanted to make sure I got her name right. Barbara Hofert, who we are very happy to welcome back to Greenwich Library tonight. She is the editor of Library Journal's Pre-Pub Alert and the first guide to what's new in publishing. Emily St. John Mandel's novels include The Glass Hotel, which was selected by President Barack Obama as one of his favorite books of 2020, and there were only 10 on the list, and has been translated into 21 languages. And Station 11, which many of us here know very well, which was a finalist for the National Book Award, the Faulkner Award, and it also won the Arthur C. Clarke Award, among others. It's also been translated into 33 languages and turned into an HBO miniseries. But Emily is no stranger to Greenwich. She first came here to Riverside, Connecticut in 2009 to talk about her second novel, The Singer's Gun, and that was back when she was known as a beloved discovery by independent booksellers. Our group was small that night. In fact, it was just my book group. But we, like the independent booksellers, we understood too that we were hearing a new voice. She returned for a much bigger crowd in 2016 when her novel Station 11 was selected as the Greenwich Reads Together pick. And again, joined us in March of 2020 for her book, The Glass Hotel, albeit that was from Zoom. While the rest of us were in lockdown, we were experimenting with sourdough starters and online knitting classes. Emily was sequestered with her husband in a halfway renovated Brooklyn house, alternately wrangling, entertaining, and homeschooling her daughter, all while writing her newest book, The Sea of Tranquility, which brings her here tonight. So please welcome my sister-in-law, Emily St. John Mandel.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you for the introduction. I am grateful for this opportunity to talk with Emily St. John Mandel about her just published Sea of Tranquility, a New York Times bestseller that had more hold requests in public libraries than any other book in the country during its first week of publication. Well done.
I didn't know that. That's amazing.
Okay. And for anyone not familiar with the book, I just want to give a quick summation so we can move forward with questions. So in 1912, young son of an Earl, Edwin St. John St. Andrew, lands in the stunning Canadian wilderness and has a dissociated moment beneath a cedar tree where he's overwhelmed by darkness and hears the notes of a violin in what seems like a vast train station. In 2020, Marilla, a former friend of Vincent, wife of the criminal financier in The Glass Hotel, seeks out Vincent's brother Paul, a composer working with a video that Vincent had made that seems to capture a moment just like Edwin's. In 2203, famed author Olive Llewellyn has come to Earth from her home in the Second Moon Colony, touring with her new book about the pandemic, which features a scene with a violinist in an airship terminal that seems to embody a moment just like those others. Finally, in 2401, members of the Time Institute noticed these anomalous moments, and eager beaver Gaspard Jacques Roberts is dispatched across time to investigate. The result is a propulsive narrative, clearly and beautifully structured, that considers what is real and what really matters. Thank you. So, Emily, your book blends four stories, those three anomalous moments, and one tying them all together through the adventures of that time-traveling detective. Where did all those stories come from? And did they come to you separately or all at once?
It's a great question, which I am going to answer. But first, I just want to thank you all for coming. I just spent 6 hours on Zoom. So if I seem a little loopy, it's not your imagination. I'm like deranged. So Right. So Sea of Tranquility with all of those threads, where it started was about 2 or 3 months before the pandemic. I'd started playing around with autofiction, which for anybody who's unfamiliar, that's autobiographical fiction, which I think of as fiction that's just slightly more obviously based on the author's life, because I think we do inevitably bring our lives and our experiences into the fiction we write. So the project there was that I wanted to write about the experience of the Epic Book Tour, which, Station 11, that tour was 114 events in 7 countries. It was kind of crazy. And on the one hand, I have such intense gratitude for this life and for being able to live this job. I would say that 99% of my interactions at events are extremely positive and like really lovely. But that 1% is something a little special. I wanted to write about these very surreal experiences that I'd had, these interactions and conversations on the road. So I had just started playing around with these fragments about an author on tour. And I remember thinking, maybe I won't do anything with this. Like, I'll just get it out of my system and move on. Or, maybe it'll be the start of something, but won't make it into the final draft. And then the pandemic hit. And, March 2020 in New York City was its own special hell. And I just had this feeling of, you know what, everything's terrible. I'm going to write a time travel book. Like, what is the maximum level of escapism that I can achieve here? It's like time travel plus moon colonies. Let's go. So I started working on that, and I started thinking through, well, what are those points in time going to be for my time traveler to visit? I've always been interested in an ancestor of mine. His name was Newell St. Andrew St. John, although he did come from London, so it would have been St. John back then. He had the kind of aristocratic background that I describe in this book, descended from William the Conqueror. He left, my real life ancestor left London under the cloud of some unspecified scandal when he was 18 years old. Everybody was extremely discreet. And he was shipped off to Canada because that was what was sort of done back then with the younger sons from wealthy families. So I'd always been interested in that. It's just a strange aspect of the Canadian immigration experience. These wealthy men with no life skills were just shipped out to the colonies and, utterly failed to make a go of it, as my great grandfather did. So I thought, okay, I'm going to pick 1912. For the next time point, I'm fascinated by February 2020, because when I look back at that month, there was such an incredible kind of mass failure of imagination where, like, we're not idiots. Like, we knew what was coming. We were following these news reports and reading about this horrible new viral outbreak on the other side of the world. New York City has 3 international airports. Like, obviously it was pouring in. And what I remember of that month is that we knew what was going to happen, but we somehow didn't believe it in a way that doesn't make any sense in retrospect. But we knew it was coming. Exactly. As Olive returns to, we go back to the autofiction. So I wanted to write about that moment. So February 2020 is the second timeline. And then the third timeline gets us to that line. And that's where I thought maybe it would be interesting to take those fragments of autofiction and filter them through a sci-fi lens. Like, would it be interesting to think about a book tour in the far future? It's the year 2301 or something. I don't remember. And just to write about it that way. That just seemed like kind of an interesting project to me. And then the final time point, we get to a time traveler. So that was how it came together over really an incredibly dark time, actually, because I was really working on it in earnest in early 2020.
Although the book isn't dark itself.
I appreciate you saying that. I don't think it is either. Like, there's a time traveling cat. I know that's a spoiler, but there are very non-dark, joyful moments in the book.
And ultimately affirmative, I think, at the end. But we'll talk about that as we go get a little more into this. What's the appeal of time travel? What's fun about it? It could also be very hard to handle if you were less competent writer.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. Thank you very much. time travel is really hard to handle
Mhm.
because well, to back up a little bit, I've always enjoyed it as a genre. I spent my teenage years mostly just reading sci-fi. That was my favorite genre for a very long time, and I still enjoy it. The trouble with time travel narratives is, how do you avoid the infinite loop? Where, like, if I step off this stage into a time machine and it takes me back to 1910, then was I not always going to step off the stage into the time machine to 1910 and around and around?
Mhm.
And then what does that do to cause and effect and free will? Which, if you lose those in a fictional character, like, there's
Mhm.
kind of nowhere to go.
Mhm.
That's a big deal. So the only way I could make time travel work for myself was by layering on this whole other level of weirdness. And that's why the simulation hypothesis is in this book,
Mhm.
which I'll just talk about it briefly in a very non-spoilery way. But that's the idea that maybe we're all living in a simulation. And what I love about that idea is you can find very smart people who will convincingly argue either side of that case. So yeah, so that was a way to make the time travel work for myself,
Mhm.
was to have a character in the far future say, we don't really get why time travel works. We think the fact that it works at all might be evidence that there's something else going on here.
Mhm.
Maybe we're living in a simulation. And also, like, it was 2020. Like, we were all kind of deranged.
And wanting to time travel,
Yeah, I
like,
would have loved to have time traveled out of spring 2020.
So it just Olive has many encounters with that you frame in the book with sort of fatuous interviewers, and one of them says, "So I'm guessing I'm not the first to ask you what it's like to be the author of a pandemic novel during a pandemic." And you notice I didn't specifically ask you that question for that very reason. I thought I wouldn't, but actually, because I actually, as I said, I don't think it's a dark novel, and I don't think of it as a pandemic novel either.
Right.
And for me, what's core to it is this notion of the simulation hypothesis and the kind of anomalous moments that it kicks off, and that kick off the entire plot.
Mhm.
And they really challenge the people in that farthest world to start thinking about, what's real, what is
Right.
reality. The time traveler, Gatsby's sister, is one of the people who first notices these anomalous moments. And when she tells him about it, he's like, "Well, your desk is real.
Right.
Your
She's like,
the
"Are you
wilted
sure?"
flowers, your hair is real."
Right.
And it's interesting to me how many times the word real and reality come up in your book. So to me, as core to this book is Gatsby's final question: what makes a world real? Well, what makes you ask that question?
Because it's interesting, and also because in a weird way, I'm kind of writing about writing a novel, where it's
Mhm.
like, what makes a world real? Well, what if I built it? Like that's, there is this weird sort of link between, on the one hand, fiction, on the other hand, this idea of the simulation. It was a really interesting question to think about, particularly in reference to the very first section of the book, which has to do with colonialism. The guy coming over from London in 1912 to Canada. And as I was thinking about the simulation hypothesis and what is a simulation and what makes the world real, I found myself going back to colonialism over and over again, because you think, well, the tragedy of colonialism, it seems to me, is that it had to do with people living inside of a false narrative, which is a kind of simulation. And it varied from place to place and country to country. But in Canada, where I'm from, the false narrative was a narrative of the empty land. This idea that here was this vast empty land just there for the taking, that wasn't true. And that's why it was a bloodbath, and why it was a tragedy. Of course, there were people already there.
Mhm.
So if you're coming across the Atlantic in the service of this absolutely false narrative, isn't that kind of the same as living in a simulation in a strange way? So I was thinking about that. I was also thinking, well, what is a simulation if we're thinking of it more as a simulated environment?
Mhm.
Cities are very simulated in a lot of ways. Your water comes to you from under the street, and electricity just kind of happens, and all these systems are in place. But it would be crazy to suggest that your life is less real in a city than it would be in the country.
Mhm.
And, if you extrapolate that out a bit further, your life would not be less real in a moon colony under an artificial dome with a false atmosphere than it would be anywhere else. So it was just a really interesting question to consider, you know, in the context of a book that moves all over the place through time.
There's another level to the reality question. One of those difficult readers tells Olive that the death of one of her characters is anticlimactic, and she thinks about it and says, well, but that's
Welcome
how
to
people
my tour.
die. No, that's real.
Yeah.
And that, which kind of, it leads to the question, what does it mean for fiction, a made up story, to be real? And how do you make it so? Like, how do you make it real for Gasperi to come to 1912 and have it be totally persuasive and believable?
Right. It's got to come down to the people, you know, but that's what I think as a fiction writer, that, well, I should back that up a little bit, not as a writer, as a reader. If I'm reading a book, I have to care about the people. Like, the people have to feel real to me. And if they do, I will follow that author anywhere, you know, including to the moon.
Including to the moon.
Including to the moon. Yeah. And that was, all of the interactions that Olive has on tour are autobiographical, except for the time traveler. So people have really said those things to me.
Yeah,
on
no,
tour.
I can
As you
tell
might have guessed.
they had a certain ring to them that made me believe that.
Yeah.
And in fact, what was really interesting to me, Olive's book tour includes a lecture on pandemics over time, which had a particularly one sentence that really struck me. We fear illness because it carries a terrible mystery.
Yeah.
Can you explain further?
Yeah. So I gave all of my Station 11 lecture because it was good material. And I did not want to deliver another lecture about pandemics ever again after 2020. So I was like, I'm just going to put that in the book. I think that is what's terrifying about illness. You know, if you think of other bad things that can happen to you, like an accident, you know, you can kind of imagine a chain of cause and effect. I leaned too far on the ladder and that's why I got hurt. But with illness, I mean, there's just this randomness to it that I think makes it really uniquely terrifying in a lot of ways, where, you know, on March 12th, 2020, like everybody else in New York City, I crammed into an overcrowded grocery store with no masks. And I didn't get COVID, but presumably it was moving through the air all around me. And I know so many people who got sick around that period. I think the randomness is what's frightening about it.
Unpredictable. You don't know what's going to happen and how it will unfold. And we do like to control things.
We do. We like to believe there's some order in the universe, but that's challenged by not just a pandemic, but the illnesses that always happen. You know, the way one person will get cancer and another person will not, with very similar life circumstances and lifestyles. And I think, that lack of order, I think, is a little bit terrifying.
Yeah, that's another thing that comes up in the book, is the term order. They're characters who crave order and then turn around and are really happy to go to the periphery in the moon colony because it's kind of wild and things aren't quite as ordered. And I think we need that back and forth in our lives.
Yeah, I agree with that. I definitely crave some order, but I sometimes prefer the neighborhoods that are not absolutely orderly.
No, that's true. All right, so Sea of Tranquility features pandemic. Olive's book, Marienbad, features pandemic. Station 11 is set in a post-apocalyptic world created by pandemic, yet Olive gives a bristly lecture on post-apocalyptic literature that makes it sound as if you yourself are a bit tired of such reductive labels. Is that true?
No, the label's fine. It was just a really good lecture I wanted to give to her. I didn't mean to become the pandemic author, and yet here we are. You know, I kind of fell into it by accident. So the project with Station 11 to go to like the obvious pandemic book was I wanted to write about a post-technological world. And a pandemic was just a horribly effective way to end the current world and get to the post-technological one. But then the craziness of the actual pandemic and the experience of being the author of Station 11 in the pandemic was so strange that I did kind of want to write about it. So that's why it's so pervasive, that idea in Sea of Tranquility.
And one of the points that she makes that again really struck me is that why do we like these post-apocalyptic disaster stories? Well, because we have this idea that our world is the world that's about to end, but in fact, aren't most worlds like that at most times? In every era, we think our world's about to end, and we keep going, you
Yeah.
know, and which I think is a strong point,
Thank
a
you.
bright point of your book. As I said, I don't think it's a
Right.
dark book. And it's also struck me that actually your future worlds are very familiar. They seem rather like our world, you know. Olive has to deal with those sexist comments about,
Mhm.
oh, it's so nice of your husband to stay home with your daughter.
Yeah.
And she's like,
That
and it's
woman
like,
was in Dallas, Texas. And like in the moment, I think I just sort of lost the power of speech. It was like- But one of the pleasures of fiction is if you think of the perfect comeback 3 months later, you can put it in the book.
yeah, yes, yes.
Yeah.
See, that's why we should all write fiction, you know. We
Yeah,
should
it's
follow
satisfying. Yeah.
Emily as a role model here. But but you know, it's kind of like, yeah, and also thinking what you had Olive say, you're telling us, we're thinking that, you know, the worlds actually don't change that much. We go through the same kinds of problems. Is that are you
Yeah.
thinking that?
You know, where that idea came from is, well, a couple of things. I had this really interesting conversation with my mother a number of years ago where she talked about how guilty she and her friends had felt bringing children into the world in the late 70s and early 80s in Western Canada. And, you know, at first it's just like, I'm sorry, what? Like, try to imagine a more tranquil time or place in all of human history. Like, you probably can't. But at the same time, that was the height of the Cold War.
Mhm.
And there was a real risk of nuclear annihilation that felt
Mhm.
very present. It's like, I get it when I think about it. So I was thinking about that, just that idea that it always feels like the world's ending.
Mhm.
But then if you push that a step further, what if the world is always ending?
Mhm.
And I don't mean that as a negative thing, which, you know, to drag my mother back on stage, which I do a lot. A few years ago, she visited New York and we went to the Morgan Library and there was an exhibition of illuminated manuscripts. And there was one in particular that I think caught both of our attention because it was kind of lovely. It was this little beautifully rendered book. It was an English translation of a French poem that had been written out by an 11-year-old Elizabeth I as a New Year's gift for her stepmother. And my mother made an interesting point, which is that the world in which that book was written was not actually that long ago. It's about 500 years old. That's what, call it 6 lifetimes laid end to
Mhm.
end. But the world in which that book was written has ended. You know, it's long since gone. You can't point to any one single thing that ended it. Like it wasn't like a Station 11 style flu pandemic or like anything dramatic like that, but it's ended nonetheless. And it just made me think, well, probably the world's always ending
Mhm.
and a new world is always kind of rising up around it to take its place. And I think usually that happens so slowly and so subtly that you can't even see it except in retrospect, unless you find yourself in an unusual historical moment.
Mhm.
And what I've been thinking of a lot lately is an op-ed that the Indian novelist Arundhati Roy wrote toward the beginning of the pandemic, where she had this wonderful turn of phrase. She said, "A pandemic is a portal." And I've been thinking about that
Mhm.
lately, how a moment like this can be a portal into the next world
Mhm.
where, you know, the world's always ending. And sometimes something like this will just kind of jolt you ahead
Mhm.
in a very different way.
And probably why we have so much resistance and so much political turmoil right now. People holding on to the old world and
Yeah,
not
I
wanting
think
to go to the new.
there is some of that. There
Yeah.
is some of that. There are also positive aspects.
Mhm.
Like, you know, something I think about is not all, but most of the people I know who have office jobs work from home for much of the week. And that would have been unthinkable before the
Mhm.
pandemic.
Mhm.
It'd be like, wait, you want to work from home 4 days a week? Like
Yeah.
that's insane. That's
Mhm.
not a thing, you know, but now that's fairly standard. It's like little things like that around workplace culture. I've taken this sudden leap.
Right. Right. Yeah. The new
Yeah.
normal can be a refreshing thought.
Yeah, I like the idea.
Yeah. There.
Yeah.
One of my favorite sentences in your book, actually, and which I think is what makes me feel it's so affirmative, is you're talking about this simulation hypothesis and people finding out that maybe they're living in a simulation and saying, so whatever, we still, this is, and the idea that we can accept, you know, you accept your
Mhm.
reality and go with it
Yeah.
is to me a very affirmative and hopeful thing, compared with the notion that it's a dark pandemic novel. And what was it like to write?
It Right. Right. I've never written a dark pandemic novel,
Yeah.
is my feeling. Yeah, I liked that idea because
Mm.
I was thinking about the simulation hypothesis. And that raises the question, well, what if it's right? What if all of this is a simulation? And I kind of felt like the correct response to that revelation would be, so what? Your life is still meaningful. The
Mhm.
choices you make still matter. You still need to be kind to people.
Okay. So can we talk a little bit more about the reality, but the reality for you as a writer, again, making Gatsby's travels back to 1912 so familiar and comfortable to us, making the future so familiar and comfortable for us. How do you do that?
It all comes down to character development.
Mhm.
You know, I always come back to that, both as a reader and a writer, where like if I can just make the people seem believable, then I feel like, you know, obviously there's a huge potential for getting everything else wrong,
Mhm.
like jolting you out of the story. But I think that is the most important thing, you know, for historical fiction or for futuristic fiction and probably
Mhm.
everything in between.
Mhm. So let's talk a little bit more about characters.
Sure.
And we've talked about Olive, but how about, why did you bring in the characters and how did they get into the novel, the characters from the Glass Hotel? How did
Right.
they
It's a
sneak
funny
in?
kind of migration, isn't
Yeah,
it?
they
Yeah.
did,
I
yeah,
opened
that-
a back door and then the next thing I know.
Yeah.
So when I was thinking about those time periods, you know, I had 1912, then I had February
Mm-hmm.
2020. And I just had this realization, like, wait, I have this whole fully developed cast of characters
Mhm.
from the book I just published, which are very plausibly hanging out in New York City in 2020. So it was partly that I already had characters from the Glass Hotel. It was partly that I'm building a multiverse and I enjoy, you know, linking the novels together.
Mhm.
Um, it's also, I keep coming back to character development, but developing characters from previous books in a new book can just be a really interesting way to see more of them, you know, in a new world and a new
Mhm.
plot. So with the Glass Hotel, the character Morella, Vincent's best friend, we don't see that much of her in the Glass Hotel
Mhm.
because she's a secondary character. And one of my core values as a novelist is velocity. You know, I want it to move fast. There can be nothing extraneous. And that means that I just don't get to spend as much time with all the characters as I'd like to sometimes. So I hadn't spent much time with her in the Glass Hotel, but I did find her really interesting. And I wanted to know what her next life might be. So I thought it would just be an interesting opportunity to see more of her in a new story. And then, yeah, and then Vincent and Paul got to come too.
Come
Yeah.
into them, and we see them, Marilla and Paul particularly, much farther along in their lives than
Yeah.
we saw them before, and they've each come a long way.
They have. I mean,
Mhm.
Paul is still a nightmare, but
But he
Right.
is working as a composer,
He is,
you know, which is, I mean, come on, I think that's good.
It's good. Like he's had some artistic success.
Small, but
Small but meaningful.
Yes.
Band's a big deal, but he's still really entitled and
yeah.
irritating. And-
Yeah. But you have to have a character like that, or it's all sugar and spice,
They,
right?
Yeah, they can all be
You know?
nice.
But I thought Edwin and Gatsby were really interesting as almost mirror images to me, because Edwin is you know, he goes to Canada and sits around.
Mhm.
You know, he doesn't. He
He's a kind of
sasses is a
inertia
word.
problem.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
the word that comes up, and he's kind of hapless in that regard. You know, it's a sort of an entitled person who doesn't understand what work is like. And Gatsby is actually, he's really bold when he goes into
Yeah.
accepting his mission, and he's actually very noble during his mission, and that, which is an important part of the book that again
Yeah.
is very affirmative. But in the beginning, he's sort of like a hapless, kind of almost unpromising soul.
Yeah.
And so what, you know, it's interesting that they mirror each other, and it's interesting to see that Gatsby had the time to change,
Mhm.
and was indeed. So what happened to him? First of all,
Gatsby?
why? Yeah, Gatsby. What made him? Why was he such an unpromising soul to begin with, and why
Right.
did you have him change so much?
Why do I write these people? He's
I
like,
know,
he's like
exactly.
Jeevan in
Come
Station
on,
11.
you know, it's
I
really
know.
important to know.
It is important to know. I think sometimes it can take a minute to figure out what the thing is that you want to do.
Mhm.
You know, you can drift through a lot of pretty boring jobs before you're like, wait, here's something that actually sparks my interest that, you know, I'm genuinely intrigued by. And yeah, I just saw him as somebody who didn't know what to do with his life for a little
Mhm.
while. and then found this direction that was really exciting to him.
Yeah, yeah, in a really significant, engaging way.
Yeah, exactly. And ultimately catastrophic, but like interesting.
Do you think if Edmund had lived, that he would have found that eventually?
I don't know. I mean,
I mean, he's been through a lot.
he's been through a lot. He has unlimited resources, which can sometimes be a disaster.
Mhm.
You know, I've certainly known people who didn't have to work and therefore wasted an incredible amount of time. Like there is sometimes a correlation, not always, but it's something about life requiring limits that Edwin is somehow slightly missing, where, you know, I think if he needed to work, he might have had an easier time figuring out the shape of his life.
Okay, well, that's good. But so in terms of what this book is really about, reality and character development, and also, I think, connection among people. Loss and loneliness are endemic to pandemic, and they surface in the book. But we also hear about Olive's devotion to her daughter, the closeness between Gasperi and his sister, the violinist's love for his wife. And these connections seem to me a significant aspect of the book. So maybe an answer to the question, what makes the world real, is love, family, closeness.
I love that. Our connections to other people.
Yeah, is that something you were driving toward?
It was. It absolutely was. And you know, it's just interesting to write about families and relationships between parents and kids. And yeah, like it's just really kind of rich, interesting experience.
Yeah.
And to your point, like love is important, you know, not just in life, but in fiction. And it's an interesting way, not just to explore your characters, but to explore how they'll react to extreme circumstances. You know, just this idea of who do you love? Like, what are the stakes? What makes the pandemic matter? You know, well, it's like the fear of the lose your family is really a big part of it.
Exactly. I mean, your loss means nothing if you don't have anything to lose.
Yeah,
you know?
exactly.
And that comes out very clearly in your writing.
Okay.
But that's true. One of the things that interested me is your language itself. It's sparer, I feel, more distilled than previous books of yours I've read. And I'm wondering if that was intentional, if that was a choice, or whether it just came from the story itself.
I think it was intentional. I think my style has definitely gone from being fairly ornate with my first novel, Last Night in Montreal. And I do really value spareness, you know, as a sort of value in my prose. This was also always going to be a short book. And I wanted it to have this velocity about it, just to move really fast for, you know, 140 pages and then stop. I think Knopf somehow made it 272, but it's 140 pages in Microsoft Word. Like, I just want to be upfront about
letting.
that.
You put more letting in between
the margins
lines,
are big.
you know?
Yeah.
Right.
But yeah, it was always going to be a short book. I wanted to do something that was either a novella or like just on the border between novella and novel. As a formal experiment as much as anything else.
And for a book that you mean to be short, it has a lot in it, 4 different stories going on in effect over centuries. So that's something to have accomplished.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, it's very good. So talking about language, let's move from the page to the screen. I know the audience will want to hear what you thought of the recent series of Station 11. And I understand that you are working on a new project that's what kept you zoomed all afternoon. The Glass Hotel will now be appearing on screen. So can you tell us a little bit about your experience with that and your thoughts?
Yeah, sure. So I'll start with the Station 11 series. I'm such a fan. I had nothing to do with that adaptation. You know, I mean, obviously I wrote the book, but I did not,
minor detail.
Yeah,
you know?
but my point is just I didn't spend 5 months on set in Canada like my friend Patrick Somerville did. Yes, I had no involvement with the production of that series, and what that meant, and it was a COVID set, so I could never visit the set. You know, COVID sets are locked down. What that means, though, is that there is a kind of magic for me in never having seen behind the scenes. So I saw it almost fully formed, you know, just a few months before everybody else did. Those performances are just spectacular. You know, I think all the time about Himesh Patel as Jeevan. I just thought that was a pretty extraordinary performance. And yeah, everything about it, you know, the music, the costuming, the writing was just so great. So Yeah, so that series came out, and then around that time, the Glass Hotel became available. So it had been optioned by NBC, and then that went nowhere. So that option expired, and Patrick Somerville, the showrunner and lead writer on Station 11, he approached my agents with this idea of what if we were to do the Glass Hotel, but with a much bigger role for Miranda, the character who's also in Station 11. And I just found that so exciting because she is such a good actor. It's Danielle Deadweiler. So I loved that idea. And, you know, it's interesting. I was offered the opportunity to be a writer on the Station 11 series like years ago when it first started. I had a conversation with Patrick where he said there could be a place for me in the writer's room. And at the time, I had zero interest in writing for television. And also, there'd been a lot of Station 11 in my life, and I was kind of ready to write the Glass Hotel, which is the project I was in. So at that time, I said, you know what, I have no idea how to write a screenplay. Like, just go do your thing, and I trust you. But I think we were all changed in some way by the pandemic. And something that changed for me personally is I don't want to just work alone in a room anymore. I really want to collaborate with other people. And television is the most collaborative art form I've ever come across. So this time I was offered an opportunity to write, and I said, yes, absolutely. I'm all in. So yeah, so this time I'm very involved with the series. I've been going back and forth from Los Angeles a lot. And in LA, it's an absolute pleasure, you know, just spending 6 hours in a room with these other writers who are as obsessed with narrative as I am. And we just build a world together. And like, it doesn't feel like work most of the time. It's amazing. When I'm in New York, it's 6 hours on Zoom, which is what I was doing all day. So, you know, that is, I do still love it. It's much harder and much less pleasurable because it's Zoom. But yeah, that's what I've been working on lately. It's been fun.
But the difference of writing for the page and screen, are you finding yourself saying whole new thing, creating new characters, changing characters as you're going along? And does that surprise you?
The characters change a lot. Also, like, it's just different when it's not just you. And also it's different depending on what the actors are bringing, where, you know, and obvious, like, just to be very upfront about it, a difference between the Glass Hotel novel and the Glass Hotel TV series is that a Black actress is playing Miranda, who's the lead in the series. And that means there is a whole other sphere of experience that's coming into this character that just wasn't there in the book. So it's really exciting. Like, it's an absolutely new dimension to the story that opens up a lot of possibilities. And that's been really cool, you know, figuring out not just that character, but all the characters and who they are with all these other people, figuring out how it can connect to the Station 11 universe, you know, the way the graphic novel might be in both. And it's, it's been really, really fun.
Okay. Do you know when that will be available to us?
HBO Max has to decide whether they want to do it or not, which happens in a couple of months. And then,
all right,
we'll write the rest of it.
All right. We're waiting. We're waiting.
Me too. I'm curious.
Okay. Just to wrap up before you do a reading, one of those fatuous interviewers Olive had to endure asked her, what message would you like readers to take away from Marienbad? You know, like, I made a note in the margin, do not ask this question. You know?
But it's the follow-up that makes it bad. The question's fine.
No. But and so Olive, this is really fun. Olive, there is no message. I was just trying to write an interesting book. And so now that we've been talking about writing for nearly an hour, what makes an interesting book?
I know I'm a broken record with the people. It's like, I keep coming back to the characters. Yeah, for me personally, I have to be interested in the characters. I have to be interested in the story in some way, like just down to just the plot level, you know, what happens and is it interesting? And this isn't quite what makes an interesting book for me, but what makes a good book for me, the prose has to be good. Right? That's a baseline for me. Yeah.
I don't know, actually, language and ideas. Okay. And now we are going to ask you to read.
Okay, sure. I'm just going to read for a couple of minutes from one of the Olive sections. The first stop on the book tour was New York City, where Olive did signing events at 2 bookstores and then found an hour to walk in Central Park before the bookseller dinner. The sheep meadow at twilight, silvery light, wet leaves on the grass. The sky was crowded with low altitude airships, and in the distance, the falling star lights of commuter aircraft streaked upward toward the colonies. Olive paused for a moment to orient herself, then walked toward the ancient double silhouette of the Dakota. 100-story towers rose up behind it. The Dakota was where Olive's new publicist was waiting, Aretta, in charge of all events in the Atlantic Republic. Aretta was a little younger than Olive and deferential in a way that made Olive nervous. When Olive walked into the lobby, Aretta stood quickly, and the hologram with whom she'd been speaking blinked out. "Did you have a nice walk in the park?" she asked, already smiling in anticipation of a positive reply. "It was lovely, thank you," Olive said. She didn't add, "It made me wish I could live on Earth," because the last time she'd confided in someone, it was repeated at dinner. "Do you know what Olive told me on the ride over?" A librarian in Montreal had reported breathlessly to a restaurant table full of waiting librarians. "She told me she was a little nervous before her talk." So now, as a matter of policy, Olive didn't reveal anything even remotely personal to anyone ever. "Well," Aretta said, "we should probably be getting to the venue. It's about 6 or 7 blocks. Should we maybe just—" "I'd love to walk," Olive said, "if you don't mind." They walked out together into the Silver City. Did Olive actually wish she could live on Earth? She vacillated on the question. She'd lived all her life in the 150 square kilometers of the second moon colony, the imaginatively named Colony 2. She found it beautiful. Colony 2 was a city of white stone, spired towers, tree-lined streets, and small parks, alternating neighborhoods of tall buildings and little houses with miniature lawns, a river running under pedestrian archways. But there's something to be said for unplanned cities. Colony 2 was soothing in its symmetry and its order. Sometimes order can be relentless. So,
Yeah, thank you.
thank you.
Okay. Now I've asked enough questions. It's now your turn, and there are people with mics. So raise hands. Anyone with? Okay, right over there.
Who are some of your favorite sci-fi authors?
My favorite sci-fi authors, I'm really into Charles Yu's work. So he won the National Book Award for Interior Chinatown, but then his more sci-fi book was How to Live Safely in a Science Fictional Universe, which was completely surreal and kind of wonderful. It came out a few years ago. I love Cixin Liu's work, The Three-Body Problem, The Dark Forest, and also Ted Chiang. I have a short story collection of his that I think is just amazing. Yeah, I read a lot of Isaac Asimov as a teenager, but to be honest, I don't remember those stories that well, so I feel like I can't call them a favorite anymore. But yeah, those are a few that I think of.
Okay, others? Right there in the green. Is it green?
Hey.
I can't tell. Okay, maybe I'm wrong. Okay.
Hi, I'm a big fan. I'm an
Thank you.
English teacher at Greenwich High School, and
Oh, cool.
I've taught Station 11, and I'm trying to make it required summer reading that all my students read Sea of Tranquility. So what I relish so much in Station 11 and Sea of Tranquility is that the power of the arts to transcend us endures. And in your futuristic worlds that you create, even if there are elements of bleakness in them, I find it so hopeful and profound that the arts are still very ever present. The traveling Shakespeare symphony in Station 11 and the violin notes in the Sea of Tranquility. I am also reminded of what Joseph Campbell says about myths, that everything begins with a story which brings a spiritual and intellectual wisdom together. That mythology is the song of the universe embedded in our collective consciousness. And also connecting to Anthony Doerr's Cloud Cuckoo Land, he says art is another way to exercise your imagination at connecting incongruous things. It's a way to say, hey, reader, let's work together and practice and train our imagination to connect things that you don't readily think of as connected. And then this effort can become political, because I think, the solution going forward is that we need to have a more planetary perspective. So my question is to you. For me, some of my favorite moments in your book are when Olive and Sylvie enact enchanted forest moments. And that's her way of sharing her artistry with her daughter. And I think I already know the answer to the question, but I'd love to hear you speak about it more. That, do you think it's the arts that will sustain us? Is that what pandemic, climate change can't take from us?
I like
Can't
that
take
idea.
from us.
That's wonderful.
That's good.
The arts definitely sustain me. And yeah, I think I'll die on that hill. I would go with that. The line in Station 11 is survival is insufficient, which you know because you taught it. But that's what I think about when I think about the arts, but not just the arts, also things like sports, where, just this idea that the basics of physical survival, the food, water, and shelter, it's never enough for us. And we always need more. And the things that fall into that kind of more category, whether it's music or soccer or Shakespeare, I think sometimes those are the things that remind us that we're human, at risk of sounding grandiose about it, and that elevate us and make us think about, what it means to be in a civilization. And it's hard to talk about without sounding grandiose, but I do think it's real. So yes, I do think that the arts could sustain us.
Over there with the stripes, and then you. Okay.
Hi.
Hi.
With regards to setting out to write the Sea of Tranquility, did you have a master plan that changed as you went, or was it pretty much laid out? Was the puzzle already complete from the outset?
It wasn't completely laid out. This is the first book I've written where I knew what the structure of the book was going to be going in. And this will come as no surprise to anybody who's read both books, but I love David Mitchell's novel, Cloud Atlas, which has that wonderful symmetrical structure that marches forward and then backward in time. And I'd always wanted to try that. I tried it with The Glass Hotel. It didn't work at all. I had to restructure the book 3 times. But there was something about Sea of Tranquility where I was able to make it work. I think just by having a time traveler. So I had this continuous narrative that could go forward and back. So I always knew that structure. I did not really have a master plan in terms of plot, though. I don't want to give spoilers, but there's something that happens at the very end of the book having to do with the character's identity, which was a total add-on when I thought the book was completely done. I just this moment of, wait, there's something missing. Oh, I could do this and then that and then this. So this was the most planned of my books, but that's a low bar. My books are not particularly planned.
Yeah.
I have a 2-part question, if you don't mind me being greedy.
How did-
First, is there a genre that you don't write in or you would never be known for, like, I don't know, erotica or something, that you would long to sort of, I don't know, guilty pleasure write, just for even for your own consumption, / what are your sort of desert island disc books? Like, what are your, you can only take these with you and read these
Right.
forever and ever?
I don't know if I want to read any book forever and ever, but a couple of my favorites. One of my very favorite books is Sweet Française by Irene Nemirovsky. I just think it's just this kind of miracle of lucidity and beauty. And then kind of related to what you were saying about genre, it's something I've thought about a lot because my books are sometimes categorized in different ways for different countries. Or I've come up against this really frustrating thing sometimes just in writing across genre, where what used to happen all the time with Station 11 is a reader would come up to me and say, I've heard your book's great, but I only read sci-fi. So like, no offense, I'm not picking up your literary fiction. Like, fine. Another reader would say, I've heard your book's really good, but I'm just more of a literary fiction person. I don't want to read something called Station 11 that's like set in the post-apocalypse. It's like, guys, it's the same book. But anyways, so because of that, it is something I've thought about a lot. And, you know, I used to think to myself, well, probably there are some genres I would never read. You know, like horror is an easy one. Like, obviously, I would never read horror, except that Ill Will by Dan Shawn is one of my favorite novels, which I think is arguably horror. If anybody's unfamiliar, his last name, Shawn, it's like chaos, but with an N. And he's very good and I think a little bit underrated. So yeah, I feel like there's no genre that I'm certain I would never write in.
Okay. Are there more questions?
I feel weird speaking into this because we're in such a small room. I was just wondering this when reading about Olive's book tour in the book. I personally, before 2020, never really thought about a pandemic or it happening. So I'm wondering your experience when you were writing Station 11. Did you have an interest in that topic beforehand, or was it something you're really thinking about? And where did that idea come from that you'd want to set your book in that?
Right. No, it wasn't really an interest. I really was just thinking, well, what is the most, this makes me sound like a psychopath when I say it, but this really was a thought process of, you know, I wanted to write in this far future post-technological world. So you got to end the world somehow is really the situation with that. So I was just thinking, what is the most effective way to get from point A to point B? And I thought, well, it could be a pandemic or it could be a nuclear holocaust. The thing with writing a book with a nuclear war is that there's a real risk of writing a book that could very quickly feel dated. And, you know, by way of illustration, I remember a friend telling me about this sci-fi novel she'd read, I think from the 70s, that was set in the aftermath of a nuclear war, whose combatants were Albania and Brazil, which like that just doesn't make sense. You know? So just because geopolitics changed so quickly that I didn't want to write something that would seem nonsensical, you know, a decade out. So that was the only reason why there was a pandemic at Station 11. It was not an interest of mine. That being said, once I was committed to it and started reading about it, the research was fascinating. So it did become an interest. At this point, we're kind of all armchair epidemiologists after the 2 years we've just had. So it's like everybody's hobby. But yeah, it is an interesting topic to me.
Other questions?
If you were to write about life on Earth further into the future, say hundreds of years, could you conceive of a civilization on Earth that doesn't end but achieves peace? And
Yeah.
then there wouldn't be much to write about. But could you see humanity evolving in such a direction where?
Yeah, absolutely. It doesn't have to be a catastrophe, which is
I would hope
something
so.
something I loved about Star Trek, by the way.
Yes.
That is utopian. You know, that's the Federation of Planets. It's the opposite of Station 11. Certainly the opposite of the road. Yeah, I could absolutely see that. And the sections of this book that are set in the far future on Earth, the year, well, it's not that far, 2203. I liked the idea that, like, look, things aren't fantastic. Like, you know, obviously things have gone down. In Olive's book tour, she's visiting the Atlantic Republic, the city-state of Los Angeles, United Carolina, the Republic of Texas. Like, obviously things have fallen apart. At the same time, there's book tour, which is kind of a utopian premise in and of itself for the future. So I like to write futuristic worlds that are neither completely dire nor completely sunny. You know, I guess the in-between is more interesting to me. Yeah, it could be boring, right? It's like writing about a happy family or just.
Okay. Okay. Other questions? Okay, well, you know, there's a signing afterwards, so please everyone stay and have more chance to talk with Emily, but I think she deserves a big round of applause.
Thank you so much. Thank you.